Hello again, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. This is the third of the talks on the topic of the Sangha. In the first talk, we had the overview. In the second talk, we considered some of the very earliest members of the Sangha, and today we'll go on to think about the Mahayana Sangha, the most famous names of the bodhisattvas who shaped the Mahayana teachings in India. Of course, the Mahayana teachings come from the Buddha himself. We can understand that in many ways, from the Buddha in his lifetime, from the Sambhogakaya of the Buddha. It's a topic we won't think about just now, but the teachings come from universal truth. The Buddha is the one who discovered that universal truth. So the Mahayana teachings come from the Buddha. In general, as we saw in the topic of the Dharma, they go much deeper into the nature of voidness, not just the voidness of ego, of self, personal self, but the voidness of everything, the voidness of all of our ideas about things, how the ideas are not the things. Those are truth, that's all. And the Buddha taught that. But of all the teachings the Buddha gave, it is thanks to the later Buddhist teachers, masters, that we have those teachings very clearly presented, very clearly in our minds. And in particular, through two masters who are really the two foundations, or the two supporting pillars of all Mahayana Buddhism. They are known as the two beautifiers of the world. And they are Nagarjuna and a Sangha. As always with Indian history, we have so little detail, and the information we have sometimes comes from different sources and doesn't really resemble, one part doesn't resemble another. But as far as we can tell, as far as we believe, then Nagarjuna came first. He came some 600 years after the Buddha. We would place him living somewhere, some people say, between the years 150 and 250 of our era, so 2nd and 3rd centuries of our era. He was somebody, it seems, who came from southern India, or towards the south. He was a human being. He is considered to be blessed by, inspired by the great bodhisattva Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom. So when we think about the first main strand of Mahayana, which is called the strand of the profound view, then we say it comes from bodhisattva Manjushri through the human being Nagarjuna, who is so famous for having brought to our world the teachings of Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom, the teachings so connected with the second phase of the three phases of Lord Buddha's teaching. So if you go back to the lectures on the Dharma, then those second turning of the wheel of Dharma, second phase teachings, are the ones that Nagarjuna brought to us. They are said to have been given by the Buddha in places like the Vulture Peak, but because the world wasn't ready for them, because it would have been too confusing for them to have come along with the other teachings from the outset, then they were stored with the Nagas and retrieved by Nagarjuna. There are many ways of understanding this, not just geographically, as though the books were somehow written and then stored, and then, like in some Hollywood movie, Nagarjuna goes there and gets them out. There is a legend like that. But what it means is that the Buddha gave those teachings and somehow they emerged in the mind of Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna gave those teachings. By the time that Nagarjuna was in India and a very active and influential Buddhist, then the teachings were being written down. And so his teachings on the Prajna Paramita became writings on the Prajna Paramita. There were writings on the Prajna Paramita already, it seems, before his time. But his ones are the ones that really put it together. So finally, a whole series of texts, perhaps the most famous are his root verses with their 27 chapters dealing with 27 areas of voidness, very much to do with the second turning of the wheel of Dharma. He gave rise to a line of disciples who not only held his teachings, but also developed them through their own writings and thinking. And that gave this profound view tradition. 150 years, perhaps more later, we have a Sangha. And a Sangha was one of two very famous brothers, Asanga and Vasubandhu. Asanga came from, some say, the Kashmir side, although it looks as though he came from further north than Kashmir, what these days is the Swat Valley going up towards Afghanistan, Peshawar type of area, the Gandhara region. At the time, Gandhara had gone down a bit in terms of Buddhist study, and Kashmir was on the way up. So Asanga actually went to Kashmir to study. The story of Asanga is a magnificent story about how his mother, who was a nun, was inspired by the fires in the Buddhist libraries to go and to have children with two different fathers and to bring them up to be people who would restore the Buddha Dharma, which indeed they did. Asanga brought marvelous things to the Mahayana. His brother Vasubandhu first did great things for the general teachings of Buddhism, particularly in the area of Abhidharma, and then later, through his contact with his brother, did things, marvelous things for Mahayana. Their story needs to be read, and in particular the story of Asanga and how he spent 12 years in retreat and the various experiences he went through before having this face-to-face meeting with Maitreya is such a terrific story. You do need to read it, and it's not today that I'll tell it. But what we find in that story is that just as Nagarjuna was inspired by the celestial bodhisattva Manjusri, Asanga is seen as being inspired by the celestial bodhisattva Maitreya. Asanga gives us 5 core teachings, 5 great treatises. And they cover all areas of Buddha Dharma. It's important to know that, because what Asanga is most famous for are the teachings on Buddha nature, the teachings of the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, the final phase of the Buddha's teachings. But it's not as though he only taught that. He taught from that context, but he taught all of the teachings of the Buddha. And his 5 masterworks really take us pretty much as far as we can go in the Buddha's teachings. From him comes the tradition of vast conduct. Vast conduct because his teachings show very clearly the different stages and levels of the path. They're not, as Nagarjuna's ones are, all focused on prajnaparamita and voidness. They show the graduated path and how that fits in with voidness. So we have Nagarjuna's profound view tradition and a Sangha's vast conduct tradition. A Sangha had disciples, in particular, later on his brother Vasubandhu, who converted to Mahayana through him and who wrote very important commentaries on his brother's works, and then a whole sequence of followers through time. Thanks to Nagarjuna and a Sangha, then we have Mahayana Buddhism as we know it. We also have, amongst our greatest teachers in India, what are known as the 6 ornaments and the 2 great ones. The 6 ornaments actually include Nagarjuna and a Sangha. They include their 2 main disciples. So Nagarjuna's main disciple or successor and someone who developed the teachings through his writings was Aryadeva, and a Sangha's main successor, the person who wrote commentaries, also was Vasubandhu, as we heard, so that gives us 4. We also have Diknaga and Dharmakirti. So they are the 6 ornaments belonging to those 2 traditions, the profound view and the vast conduct. The 2 great ones are singled out because of their expertise in Vinaya. They really made very clear the teachings of the Buddha on conduct, and in particular on conduct for those who've taken the various levels of vows of the monks and of the nuns. They are Sakhyaprabha and Gunaprabha. The teachings that came from Nagarjuna were handed on to Ayadeva, who wrote commentaries on them, and from him they passed on to Rahulabhadra. And what we find in his disciples is then a split of opinion about the meaning of the teachings of that lineage, due to the commentaries written by Buddha Palita and Bhava Viveka. And these gave rise to the 2 schools of Svatantrika and Prasangika thinking, which will be of interest to those who study and will start to become too confusing for those of you who aren't really into the studies of the middle way. So we can perhaps mention one more generation in that lineage, which is that of Chandrakirti, who very much defended Buddha Palita's point of view in his very famous introduction to the middle way. For the other lineage, the vast conduct, then as we know, Vasubandhu wrote commentaries to a Sangha's work, and in particular he gives us a terrific one about the bodhisattva levels, but very, very important writings. He's also wrote a major work on Abhidhamma from both the Hinayana, Mahayana points of view. So then in his line, we have these great scholars, Diknaga and Dharmakirti. Those 6 ornaments are the ones who shaped the ideas of Mahayana. But of course, there were many, many other great Mahayana Buddhists and practitioners. Perhaps one who's so famous is Shantideva. his Bodhisattva's way of life is perhaps the most studied, the most authoritative text on the way that Bodhisattvas actually practice. But it's not as though he formulated new ideas. So that's why we particularly single out those 6. And of course later on we have great scholars like Shantarakshita, the one who took the scholarly side of things to Tibet when Dharma was founded there. Those then are the great names of Mahayana Buddhism in India. They're the ones who shaped the ideas. The Dharma went to Tibet, and I suppose many of us are very interested in Tibetan Buddhism. We're following Tibetan Buddhism. So there we can't really see new ideas emerging. There were many fantastic authors who give us great insight into the Mahayana teachings that came from India. And perhaps what we could say is that amongst the Tibetan lamas, then we see some of them as being what are known as emanations of the great bodhisattvas who were with the Buddha at the time of his teaching. So how does that work? The Mahayana vision is that when the Buddha taught in India during those 45 years, that there were humans present, but also many other beings that some of the humans were aware of and some of them were not aware of. And the Buddha, who was this vast teaching presence, was teaching all of them, each one according to their level. Like a huge mirror where 100 people look in the mirror and they see the reflection that their own eyes can see. So the Buddha's mind was this amazing presence teaching, each one according to their capacities. We have a very good example of that these days with our great teachers and Rinpoches. We see how they're teaching the beginners, they're teaching the most advanced yogis, each one according to their levels. And it's not as though everyone gets everything, far, far from it. So at the time of Buddha, there were human beings, there were devas, there were nagas, all sorts of invisible beings, and also these great bodhisattvas, already beautiful minds, not necessarily needing a human body, but drawn by the teachings of the Buddha. So we see those minds as appearing later in Tibet as human beings. Another way of seeing it is that some of the Tibetan teachers, through their practice, through their karma, were so pure that, for instance, those whose lives were the very embodiment of loving kindness are said to be emanations of Chinrezig, the Buddha of loving kindness. Those who were so brilliantly wise and such great scholars are said to be like emanations of Manjusri. Those who nurture the Sangha are said to be like emanations of Ananda, and so on and so forth. In particular, in the Kagyu lineage, then we have the Karmapa, who's seen as the emanation of Bodhisattva Chinrezig. And within the Kagyu lineage, we see all the main Bodhisattvas, Chinrezig, Manjusri, and Vajrapani, and so on, present as the great names of the lineage. And many others. For instance, in Gampopa's story, we learn how at the time of Buddha, he was this great Bodhisattva Chandra Prabha Kumara, who requested the teachings we know now as the King of Meditation Sutra, the Samadhi Raj Sutra, which is the very basis for the Mahamudra teachings. So he was that great bodhisattva. The Buddha said he'd served thousands of Buddhas before. a great cosmic presence that then incarnated in Tibet as the master Gampopa, along with Bodhisattva Chimrezik, who was the first Karmapa, Gampopa's disciple, and so it goes on. When we get to this less obviously historical level, then it becomes more complicated. I'd say impossible, really, to know what is going on. There are so many ways we can see it. But in general, we understand that the force of goodness, the Bodhisattva Sangha, as humans, as beings of light, incredibly subtle minds whose influence we can feel in various ways, all of those have held the teachings, have held the Mahayana teachings, have kept them alive. When it was necessary, have refreshed those teachings. When the teachings come to new places, new countries, then they've been the ones who emanated or who blessed the mind of teachers so that the teachings of love, of compassion, of voidness, of Buddha nature would remain pure and strong generation after generation. It was just a few words, very simple words, to remind us that in the Sangha we also have the Bodhisattva Sangha. I think there will be at least one more talk on the Sangha, and this will be about the Vajrayana Sangha in India and in Tibet. Thank you, as always, for listening to these teachings. I do hope they help you. I do hope they help us all. I wish you an excellent day, wherever you are. Thank you. Buddha bless you.